They called it impossible. A small nation with barely 1 million people somehow dominated the world's oceans for over a century. Spain had more gold. England had more people. The Ottoman Empire had more power. But Portugal had something nobody else could replicate. And it wasn't just courage. It wasn't just better sailors. It was hidden in plain sight, in every plank, every beam, every curve of their legendary caravels. While other nations were building ships that rotted within 5 years, Portuguese vessels were crossing oceans decade after decade, surviving storms that should have destroyed them. The secret wasn't just what they built, it was how they built it. And today, I'm going to reveal the forgotten technology that changed history forever. But before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button and smash the like button right now. Trust me, what you're about to discover will completely change how you see maritime history. Let's get started. I still remember the first time I stood inside a replica of a Portuguese carrack at the Maritime Museum in Lisbon. I ran my hands across the thick wooden beams, marveling at the craftsmanship, but it was what the curator told me next that stopped me in my tracks. "This wood," he said quietly, "was treated using methods we still don't fully understand today." That moment changed everything for me. It sent me down a rabbit hole of research, ancient manuscripts, and conversations with maritime historians that would reveal one of history's greatest technological secrets. Today, I'm sharing everything I discovered about the hidden technology that gave Portugal a 100-year advantage over every other maritime power in the Age of Discovery. This isn't just a story about ships. It's a story about innovation, secrecy, and how a small nation on the edge of Europe changed the entire world. Let me paint a picture for you. It's the early 1400s. Portugal is a tiny kingdom squeezed against the Atlantic Ocean on the western edge of the Iberian Peninsula. To the east lies Spain, a much larger and more powerful neighbor. To the south, across the Strait of Gibraltar, the sophisticated Islamic kingdoms of North Africa control trade routes that have existed for centuries. To the north, France and England are locked in the 100 Years' War, commanding vast resources and populations. Portugal has approximately 1 million people. That's it. 1 million souls in a kingdom roughly the size of Indiana. They have no significant gold mines, no vast agricultural lands, no large standing army. By every measure that mattered in the 15th century, Portugal should have been a footnote in history, a minor kingdom destined to be absorbed by Spain or to fade into irrelevance. But here's what actually happened. Within a single century, this tiny nation established trade routes to India, China, Japan, and Brazil. They built fortresses on 4 continents. They became the wealthiest nation per capita in Europe. Portuguese became the lingua franca of trade from Mozambique to Macau. Their ships appeared in harbors where European vessels had never been seen before. How did this happen? The traditional answer you'll find in history books talks about Prince Henry the Navigator, about Portuguese courage and determination, about favorable winds and exploratory spirit. And yes, all of that played a role. But I'm here to tell you there was something else, something far more concrete and technological that made all of it possible. Portuguese ships were simply better. Not just better designed, but fundamentally superior in construction, durability, and longevity. While a Spanish or English ship might last 5 to 7 years before becoming unseaworthy, Portuguese vessels routinely sailed for 15, 20, even 30 years. In an age when building a ship required years of work and enormous resources, this difference was absolutely game-changing. Think about the economics for a moment. If you're a merchant or a monarch financing expeditions, and you know that a Portuguese ship will last 3 or 4 times longer than a Spanish equivalent, that completely changes your calculations. The initial investment might be higher, the construction time longer, but the return on investment is dramatically better. You can send that ship on voyage after voyage, year after year, while your competitors are constantly building replacements. This economic advantage compounded over time. The Portuguese could maintain larger fleets with smaller investments. They could take risks on longer voyages because their ships were reliable enough to attempt them. They could establish permanent trade routes because they had vessels that could make the journey repeatedly without falling apart. But why? What were the Portuguese doing differently? The answer lies in something so fundamental that other nations completely overlooked it: the wood itself. I need you to understand something crucial about shipbuilding in the age of discovery. A wooden sailing ship wasn't just transportation. It was a complex living system that had to withstand forces that would tear apart almost any structure humans could build. Think about it. A ship had to be light enough to float and fast enough to sail, yet strong enough to survive Atlantic storms with waves as tall as buildings. It had to flex with the waves without breaking, resist the constant assault of salt water, and maintain its integrity through temperature extremes from African heat to North Atlantic cold. Wood seems like a simple material, but it's actually incredibly complex. It's a biological composite made up of cellulose fibers bound together by lignin, with a cellular structure that varies depending on the species, the growing conditions, and how the tree was processed after being cut. Every piece of wood is different, and those differences matter enormously when you're trying to build something as demanding as an ocean-going ship. The Portuguese obsession with wood began with a single species, Quercus robur, the European maritime oak. Now, oak trees grew all over Europe, so you might wonder what made Portuguese oak special. Here's where the story gets interesting. The Portuguese didn't just use any oak. They specifically harvested trees from particular forests in northern Portugal and Galicia, forests where the trees grew slowly in rocky, poor soil. Why does this matter? Because trees that grow slowly develop denser wood. The growth rings are tighter, the cellular structure more compact. This density translated directly into strength and resistance to rot. But it goes deeper than that. The Portuguese discovered something that modern materials science has only recently confirmed. The specific mineral content of the soil where an oak tree grows affects the chemical composition of the wood itself. The granite-rich soils of northern Portugal produced oak with higher levels of certain tannins and minerals that acted as natural preservatives. I found references to this in a 16th century manuscript written by João Baptista Lavanja, one of Portugal's chief cosmographers. He described how master shipwrights would travel to forests and spend days examining trees, not just for size and straightness, but for specific characteristics that indicated the tree had grown in the right type of soil. They would look at the bark texture, the pattern of branches, even taste the wood to assess its tannin content. Yes, you heard that right. They would taste the wood. They had learned through generations of experience that wood from the best trees had a particular bitter taste from the tannins, and they could actually assess quality by chewing small samples. This might sound primitive, but it was actually a remarkably sophisticated form of materials testing. This level of botanical knowledge was extraordinary for its time. While other nations were simply cutting down the biggest trees they could find, Portuguese shipwrights were practicing what we would today call materials engineering. They understood that not all oak was created equal, and they had developed empirical methods to identify the best specimens. The selection process was so rigorous that only about 1 in 10 trees examined would actually be marked for harvest. Royal forests were carefully managed, with certain areas designated for future shipbuilding and protected from other uses. Trees would be marked decades before they would be cut, allowing foresters to track and manage the resource over generations. There's a fascinating detail I discovered in the archives. Portuguese forestry laws from the 15th century prescribed specific punishments for anyone who damaged trees marked for royal shipbuilding. The penalties were severe, including fines that would bankrupt most families, and even corporal punishment for repeat offenders. This shows just how seriously Portugal took the protection of its shipbuilding resources. But selecting the right tree was just the beginning. What happened next was even more remarkable. Here's where Portuguese shipbuilding diverged dramatically from practices in other nations, and where their true technological advantage began. When an English or Spanish shipwright cut down an oak tree, they might let the wood dry for a year, maybe two if they were particularly cautious, before using it in ship construction. The Portuguese, they waited 20 years, sometimes even longer. Let me repeat that because it sounds insane. 20 years. In some cases, for the most critical structural members, they waited up to 30 years. That's an entire generation. I discovered the details of this process in the archives of the Casa de India in Lisbon, where Portuguese maritime operations were coordinated. The Portuguese developed an elaborate system they called seasoning or curing, though these terms don't really capture the sophistication of what they were doing. First, immediately after a tree was felled, it was cut into rough planks but left much thicker than the final dimensions needed. These planks were then submerged in seawater, not just any seawater, but in specific tidal estuaries, where fresh water from rivers mixed with Atlantic salt water. The planks would remain submerged for 1 to 2 years. Why? The Portuguese had discovered that this initial submersion accomplished several things. First, it leached out sap and sugars from the wood, removing the very substances that fungi and marine organisms feed on. Second, the salt water penetrated deep into the wood's cellular structure, depositing salt crystals that would act as a preservative. Third, and this is fascinating, certain minerals in the estuarine water would bind with compounds in the oak, creating chemical complexes that increase the wood's resistance to decay. The choice of location for this submersion was critical. Not just any estuary would work. Portuguese shipwrights preferred areas where rivers carrying sediment from granite mountains met the sea. The mineral-rich water from these specific locations seemed to produce superior results. Modern chemical analysis of wood from Portuguese shipwrecks has confirmed that these planks contain unusual concentrations of certain minerals that came from the water they were submerged in. After this initial submersion, the planks were removed and slowly dried in covered but open-air sheds. Not in the sun, which would cause too rapid drying and cracking, but in shade where air could circulate freely. The sheds were oriented to catch prevailing breezes, and the planks were stacked with spaces between them to ensure air could flow around all surfaces. This drying process took 5 to 7 years. During this time, the planks would be regularly inspected, rotated, and any pieces showing defects would be culled. Workers would check for warping, splitting, insect damage, or signs of rot. About 20 to 30% of planks would be rejected during this phase. The rejected wood wasn't wasted, though. It would be used for non-critical applications, interior fittings, or even sold for use in building construction. But it would never be used in the hull of a royal vessel. But we're not done. After this initial drying, the planks would be planed down closer to their final dimensions, and then subjected to a second treatment. Some sources describe submersion in wine or vinegar. Others mention coating with pine resin mixed with specific herbs. The exact formulas were guild secrets, passed from master to apprentice and varied between different shipyards. One formula I found described in a 17th century document called for soaking the wood in red wine mixed with garlic extract, copper sulfate, and ground oyster shells. Another called for a bath of vinegar infused with rue, wormwood, and other bitter herbs, followed by a coating of pine pitch mixed with sulfur and red lead oxide. The purpose of these treatments was multifold. The acidic solutions, whether wine or vinegar, would further alter the chemistry of the wood, making it less hospitable to decay organisms. The metallic compounds added toxicity that would deter marine borers. The bitter herbs added additional chemical defenses, and the final pitch coating would seal everything in and provide a water-resistant barrier. After this second treatment, the wood would be dried again for another 5 to 10 years. Only then, after a minimum of 15 to 20 years from when the tree was first cut, would the wood be considered ready for use in ship construction. Now, I want you to really think about what this meant practically. It meant that Portuguese shipbuilding required incredible foresight and planning. It meant maintaining vast stockpiles of wood in various stages of seasoning. It meant that master shipwrights were working with timber that had been selected by their predecessors, sometimes by people who had died years earlier. In Lisbon, along the Tagus River, there were massive warehouses dedicated solely to storing seasoning timber. These warehouses were among the largest structures in the city. Inventories from the 16th century describe stockpiles containing hundreds of thousands of planks and beams in various stages of preparation. The logistics of managing all this material, tracking where each piece came from and how long it had been seasoning, required sophisticated record-keeping systems. The Portuguese developed a marking system where information about each piece of wood was actually carved into the wood itself. The marks would indicate the forest it came from, the year it was cut, the treatments it had received, and when it would be ready for use. These marks would be cut deep enough that they remained visible even after the wood was shaped and installed in a ship, but the results were undeniable. When Portuguese wood was finally used in ship construction, it was fundamentally different from fresh-cut timber. It was lighter, having lost much of its moisture content. A fully seasoned oak plank might weigh 30 to 40% less than the same plank when freshly cut. This weight reduction meant ships could carry more cargo or provisions without compromising structural integrity. It was harder, with a density that made it extremely resistant to boring organisms like shipworm. The teredo worm, or shipworm, which isn't actually a worm but a type of saltwater clam, was one of the greatest threats to wooden ships. These creatures would bore into ship hulls, creating extensive tunnel networks that could weaken a ship catastrophically. Fresh timber was extremely vulnerable to shipworm attack, but properly seasoned Portuguese oak was so dense and chemically altered that shipworms had difficulty penetrating it. The wood was also chemically altered in ways that made it hostile to fungal growth. Dry rot, caused by various species of fungi, was another major cause of ship deterioration. The combination of salt impregnation, chemical treatments, and thorough drying created an environment where fungi simply couldn't establish themselves. And perhaps most importantly, it was dimensionally stable. It wouldn't warp or twist as it aged, because it had already done all its aging before it was ever shaped into a ship. This is crucial, because a ship's hull is under constant stress. If the wood warps or changes shape after construction, it can open gaps in the hull, weaken joints, or create structural problems. Portuguese ships, built from thoroughly seasoned timber, maintained their shape and integrity far longer than vessels built from green or inadequately seasoned wood. The difference in ship longevity was dramatic. I found records of Portuguese vessels making voyage after voyage for 20 or 30 years, while Spanish and English ships of similar size were being retired or completely rebuilt after just 5 to 7 years of service. In the economics of the Age of Discovery, where a single ship represented an enormous capital investment, this difference was absolutely transformative. One specific example really drives this home. The São Gabriel, one of Vasco da Gama's ships on his pioneering voyage to India in 1497, was built in 1496 using wood that had been seasoning since the 1470s. After completing the India voyage, that ship continued in service for another 12 years, making multiple additional voyages before finally being retired. By contrast, Spanish ships built around the same time typically lasted only 5 to 7 years in similar service. But superior wood was only one part of the equation. The Portuguese also pioneered revolutionary hull designs that other nations struggled to replicate. Let me explain why hull design mattered so much. Before the Portuguese innovations, European ships generally fell into two categories. You had heavy, stable cargo vessels that were slow and couldn't sail well against the wind. These were fine for coastal trading or traveling established routes with favorable winds. Then you had lighter, faster warships that were too fragile for long ocean voyages and couldn't carry much cargo. What Portugal needed was something entirely different. A ship that could sail into unknown waters against prevailing winds, survive Atlantic storms, carry enough cargo to make long voyages profitable, and do it all reliably for years at a time. No existing ship design could do all of these things. The solution was the Carvel, and later the larger Carracan. These designs represented a fundamental rethinking of ship architecture. Let me walk you through the key innovations. First, the Portuguese developed a hull shape that was narrow relative to its length, with a pronounced V-shaped cross-section below the waterline. This shape cut through waves rather than riding over them, making the ships faster and more stable in rough seas. The length-to-beam ratio of Portuguese caravels was typically around 3.5 to 1 or even 4 to 1, much narrower than the two. 5 to 1 or 3 to 1, common in other European vessels of the period. But here's the clever part. Above the waterline, the hull flared outward, creating extra deck space and cargo capacity without sacrificing the hydrodynamic efficiency of the underwater hull shape. This tumble-home design, as it's called, also had structural advantages. The inward curve of the upper hull helped hold the deck beams in compression and provided additional lateral stability. This wasn't just artistic or intuitive. Portuguese shipwrights were doing something we would recognize today as naval architecture. They were systematically testing different hull shapes and learning what worked. There are records from the Arsenal Real de Lisboa showing that models of hull designs were tested in water tanks, a practice that wouldn't become common in other European nations for another 2 centuries. These models weren't crude approximations. They were carefully scaled replicas, built to precise proportions. Shipwrights would test them by towing them through water tanks, observing how they moved through the water, how they responded to simulated waves, and how stable they were when loaded with scale weights. Based on these tests, designs would be refined before any full-size ship was constructed. This empirical approach to design was revolutionary. Most shipbuilding at the time was based on tradition and rules of thumb passed down through generations. If a design worked, you repeated it. If it didn't work, you might try modifications, but there was no systematic method for understanding why something worked or didn't work. The Portuguese were different. They were experimenting, testing, and learning. They were developing what we would call today a scientific approach to engineering. Second, the Portuguese pioneered the use of multiple masts with different sail configurations. The famous lateen sail, triangular and mounted at an angle, gave Portuguese ships the ability to sail much closer to the wind than square-rigged vessels. A square-rigged ship might only be able to sail within about 70 or 80 degrees of the wind direction. A Portuguese caravel with lateen sails could sail within 45 or 50 degrees of the wind. This capability was absolutely crucial for exploration. When you're sailing into unknown waters, you can't count on favorable winds. You need to be able to make progress regardless of wind direction. The ability to sail close to the wind meant Portuguese ships could explore coastlines that would be inaccessible to square-rigged vessels. But the Portuguese didn't just use lateen sails exclusively. They mixed them with square sails in a hybrid configuration that gave them flexibility. A typical Portuguese caravel might have 2 or 3 masts, with the forward masts carrying square sails for running before the wind, and the rear mast or masts carrying lateen sails for maneuverability and sailing close to the wind. This mixed rig gave Portuguese captains options. In favourable winds, they could set the square sails and make excellent speed. In contrary winds, they could rely on the lateen sails to make progress. They could adjust their sail plan for different wind conditions, something that gave them an enormous tactical advantage. There's a wonderful account from a Portuguese pilot named João de Lisboa, writing in the early 1500s, where he describes the art of adjusting sail configurations for different situations. He talks about how an experienced captain could optimize sail arrangement not just for wind direction, but for sea state, current, proximity to shore, and many other factors. This level of sophistication in sail handling was unique to Portuguese mariners at the time. Third, and this is crucial, Portuguese hull construction used a specific method of joining planks that distributed stress more evenly across the hull. While I'll get into the technical details of Carvel construction in a moment, what matters here is that Portuguese ships flexed with the waves in a controlled way. They were designed to bend without breaking, to absorb the enormous forces of storm waves without coming apart. I found a beautiful description of this in a letter written by an Italian sailor who served on a Portuguese vessel in the early 1500s. He described sailing through a massive storm off the Cape of Good Hope and watching the ship's beams actually flex and move, and being terrified that the ship was breaking apart. But the Portuguese crew was calm. They explained to him that the ship was designed to move like this, that the flexibility was what kept it alive. The ship, they told him, was breathing with the sea. This was a radically different philosophy from shipbuilding in other nations, where the goal was often to make ships as rigid and solid as possible. The Portuguese understood something that modern engineers know well. Sometimes flexibility is stronger than rigidity. A rigid structure will break when stressed beyond its limits. A flexible structure can absorb and dissipate stress, surviving forces that would destroy a more rigid design. Now I want to get into the technical details of how Portuguese ships were actually built, because this is where some of their most important innovations lay. If you've ever looked at a Viking longship or early medieval European vessels, you've probably noticed that the hull planks overlap like shingles on a roof. This is called clinker construction, or lapstrake, and it was the dominant shipbuilding method in Northern Europe for centuries. Clinker construction has advantages. It's relatively fast, it creates a strong hull, and the overlapping planks actually add rigidity. The method also allows for some flexibility in the hull because the overlapping joints can slide slightly against each other. But it also has serious limitations. First, the overlapping joints create drag in the water, slowing the ship. Every overlap is a small ridge projecting into the water flow, creating turbulence and resistance. For a small vessel traveling short distances, this might not matter much. But for a ship making long ocean voyages, even a small increase in drag translates to significantly slower speeds and longer journey times. More importantly, the overlapping areas trap moisture and marine organisms, leading to faster rot. Water gets between the overlaps and can't easily drain out. Marine organisms find sheltered spaces to attach and burrow. Over time, the wood in these overlap areas deteriorates much faster than exposed surfaces, and the method doesn't scale well to larger ships. As a ship gets bigger, the stresses on the hull increase dramatically. Clinker construction relies on the overlapping planks supporting each other, but in very large vessels, this distributed support system becomes inadequate. The planks themselves need to be thicker to handle the stress, which makes the ship heavier and more expensive to build. The Portuguese, learning from Mediterranean traditions but innovating far beyond them, perfected what's called Carvel construction. In this method, hull planks are laid edge to edge, creating a smooth outer surface. The planks are attached to a strong internal framework of ribs and beams. Now, this sounds simple, but it's actually much more difficult to execute properly. With clinker construction, each plank supports the next, and the overlaps help hold everything in place. With Carvel construction, the entire hull depends on the strength of the internal framework and the precision of how planks are fitted together. This is where Portuguese woodworking skill became crucial. The planks had to be shaped precisely to fit edge to edge with minimal gaps. We're talking about gaps no wider than a few millimeters along seams that might be several meters long, fitting together curved surfaces that had to match exactly. The Portuguese developed specialized tools and techniques for this purpose. They used something called dubbing, where planks were carefully shaped while still attached to the frame, using long planes and specialized curved blades to achieve perfect fits. A master shipwright might spend days working on a single plank, constantly checking the fit, making tiny adjustments, ensuring everything was perfect. They also developed sophisticated methods for creating the curved shapes needed for hull planks. Some curves were achieved by selecting timber that had grown naturally curved, but for specific shapes, they used steam bending, heating planks with steam until the wood became pliable, then bending them to the required curve and holding them in place until they cooled and set. The internal framework of Portuguese ships was also innovative. They used a combination of full frames that ran from one side of the ship to the other, and half frames that provided additional support in areas of high stress. The spacing and arrangement of these frames was carefully calculated based on the size of the ship and the expected stresses. But here's the innovation that really mattered. The Portuguese developed a specific method of sealing the seams between planks that was far superior to anything used elsewhere. In other nations, ships were typically caulked with oakum, loose fibers from old rope soaked in tar and hammered into the seams between planks. This worked, but oakum deteriorated relatively quickly, especially in tropical waters. The Portuguese used a multi-layered approach. First, the seams were filled with a mixture that included oakum, but also cork fibers. Portugal had abundant cork oak forests, and they discovered that cork fibers, which are naturally water-resistant and elastic, created a more durable seal than hemp fibers alone. Cork is remarkable material. Its cellular structure is made up of millions of tiny air-filled chambers with walls that are both flexible and water-resistant. When compressed into a ship's seam, cork fibers create a seal that's elastic enough to accommodate the ship's flexing, but tight enough to keep water out, and unlike hemp, cork doesn't absorb water and rot. This mixture of oakum and cork fibers was hammered into place using specialized caulking irons and mallets. The process required skill and patience. Too little pressure and the seam wouldn't be tight. Too much pressure and the wood could split. Master caulkers could tell by sound and feel when the compression was exactly right. Then, and this is the key innovation, the seams were coated with a preparation made from pine resin, beeswax, and powdered minerals. The exact formula varied, but most included red lead oxide and other compounds. This coating was applied hot and penetrated deep into the oakum cork mixture, creating a seal that was flexible, water-resistant, and toxic to the marine organisms that typically attack ship hulls. The preparation was heated in large pots until it became liquid, then brushed onto the seams while still hot. The heat would drive the mixture deep into the caulking material and even slightly into the wood itself. As it cooled, it would solidify, creating a waterproof seal that was chemically bonded to both the caulking and the wood. I found a fascinating account from a Dutch shipwright who visited Portuguese shipyards in the 1590s. He described watching this caulking process and being amazed at the care and time invested. Where Dutch ships might be caulked in a few days by a small crew, Portuguese ships spent weeks on this crucial phase of construction, with large teams working methodically along every seam. The Dutch shipwright noted somewhat dismissively that the Portuguese were overly particular and slow, but then admitted that Portuguese ships do endure far longer in service than our own vessels. He estimated that a Portuguese ship might last 3 times as long as a Dutch equivalent, a difference he attributed primarily to the superior caulking methods. The Carvel construction method also allowed Portuguese ships to be larger and carry more cargo than clinker-built vessels. A smooth hull moves through water more efficiently, reducing drag and allowing for faster speeds or lower power requirements. The strong internal framework can support more weight distributed more evenly throughout the hull. This made long-distance trade voyages more economically viable. A Portuguese carrack could carry 2 or 3 times the cargo of a similar-sized clinker-built vessel while traveling faster and lasting longer. The economic implications were enormous. Beyond the wood selection, seasoning, and construction methods, the Portuguese had another trick up their sleeve, a sophisticated understanding of chemical preservation that was far ahead of its time. This is one of the least known aspects of Portuguese maritime technology, but it may have been one of the most important. All wooden ships faced a constant battle against 3 enemies: rot caused by fungi, attack by marine-boring organisms like shipworm and gribble, and the slow degradation caused by sun, salt, and sea. Most European maritime powers fought these enemies reactively. When a ship started showing signs of damage, they would repair it, replace damaged sections, or eventually scrap the vessel entirely. The Portuguese took a proactive approach. They treated their ships with preservative compounds before damage occurred, and they did so using a level of chemical knowledge that seems remarkably sophisticated for the 15th and 16th centuries. One of the most important Portuguese innovations was the use of what they called betume, a complex mixture used to coat the underwater portions of ship hulls. I found several different formulas in historical records, but most share common elements: pine tar or pitch as a base, mixed with sulfur, various metallic oxides, and sometimes organic compounds like garlic extract or bitter plant oils. This sounds almost like medieval alchemy, and in a sense it was, but there was real chemistry at work. Sulfur compounds are toxic to many fungi and bacteria. When sulfur is combined with certain metallic oxides, it forms compounds that are even more toxic to biological organisms, but relatively safe for humans to handle. Metallic oxides, like those of copper, lead, and arsenic, create environments hostile to marine life. The pine tar base is naturally water repellent and creates a physical barrier. But here's what's fascinating. Modern analysis of wood samples from preserved Portuguese shipwrecks shows evidence of chemical compounds that we wouldn't expect from the known ingredients. This suggests the Portuguese were using additional substances that weren't recorded, possibly because the exact formulas were closely guarded secrets, or possibly because they were working with naturally occurring materials whose chemical complexity they didn't fully understand. For example, there's evidence of organoselenium compounds in some samples. These are extremely effective as antifoulants, preventing marine organisms from attaching to the hull. Modern anti-fouling paints often use similar chemistry, but selenium compounds aren't mentioned in any Portuguese shipbuilding manual I found. Where were they coming from? One theory, proposed by a team of marine archaeologists I spoke with, is that certain seaweeds harvested along the Portuguese coast and used in some preparation formulas naturally concentrate selenium from seawater. The Portuguese may have been using these seaweeds empirically, knowing they worked without understanding why. There are references in several historical documents to seaweed being collected, dried, and burned to create ash that was then mixed into hull coatings. The people doing this work thought they were using the seaweed for its salt content, or perhaps some mystical property. But what they were actually doing was concentrating trace elements from the ocean, including selenium, into a form that could be incorporated into protective coatings. The Portuguese also developed specialized treatments for different parts of the ship. The areas below the waterline received the most intensive treatment with the betume mixtures I described. But other areas had different vulnerabilities and received different treatments. The deck planks, exposed to sun and rain, were treated with mixtures rich in oil and wax that prevented water absorption and protected against UV degradation. Historical records mention combinations of linseed oil, whale oil, and specific plant waxes. The linseed oil would penetrate into the wood, while the harder waxes would form a protective surface layer. One formula I found called for linseed oil boiled with crushed lavender flowers and certain tree resins, then mixed with beeswax and carnauba wax. The lavender wasn't just for fragrance. It contains compounds that have natural antimicrobial properties. The mixture would be applied hot and worked into the wood until the surface had a hard, water-resistant finish. The internal framing, particularly in the bilge where water accumulates, was treated with preparations that included vinegar, salt, and sometimes lime. These created an alkaline, salty environment that inhibited microbial growth. The bilge is one of the most vulnerable areas of any wooden ship because water inevitably collects there, creating ideal conditions for rot. By creating a chemically hostile environment, the Portuguese could significantly slow deterioration in this critical area. Even the sails and rigging weren't neglected. Sails were soaked in solutions that included tannins from oak bark, which made the canvas more resistant to mildew and rot. The tannins would bind to the cellulose fibers of the canvas, making them less susceptible to biological breakdown. Treated sails lasted significantly longer than untreated canvas and were less prone to weakening when wet. Ropes were treated with tar and special oils that helped them resist the constant flexing and salt exposure they endured. But the Portuguese went further. They would sometimes incorporate copper wire into the core of important lines, which provided additional strength and, through a mechanism they didn't understand at the time, also helped prevent rot. The copper ions released from the wire had antimicrobial properties that protected the organic fibers around it. What impresses me most about all of this is the systematic nature of it. The Portuguese weren't just randomly trying different treatments, they were maintaining institutional knowledge, testing methods, keeping records of what worked and what didn't. This was maritime technology development in a recognizably modern sense. Ships would be inspected regularly, and observations about which treatments were holding up and which weren't would be recorded. Shipwrights would compare notes, discussing what worked in different conditions. A treatment that worked well in the cold waters of the North Atlantic might not be as effective in tropical regions, and vice versa. The Portuguese systematically documented these differences and adjusted their methods accordingly. Now, I want to talk about the people behind all of this technology, because the innovations I've described didn't emerge spontaneously. They were developed, refined, and protected by a remarkable system of master craftsmen organized into one of history's most effective guilds. Portuguese shipbuilding was controlled by the Guild of Master Shipwrights, headquartered in Lisbon, and with chapters in other major ports, including Porto, Lagos, and later in colonial cities. This wasn't just a social organization or trade union. It was a sophisticated system for preserving and advancing technical knowledge while maintaining strict control over who could practice the craft. To become a master shipwright in Portugal, you had to complete an apprenticeship that lasted 15 to 20 years. That's not a typo. 20 years. For comparison, most craft apprenticeships in other European countries lasted 7 years at most. Some English shipwright apprenticeships were as short as 3 years. What were these apprentices learning? For 2 decades. Everything I've described and much more. They learned how to select trees in the forest, examining bark, growth patterns, even the sound a tree made when struck with a mallet. They learned how to direct the seasoning process, knowing when to move wood from one stage to another, how to identify defects that might not become apparent for years. They learned how to read the grain of wood and understand its properties, predicting how it would behave under stress or in different environments. They learned geometry and the complex calculations needed to design hull curves. Portuguese shipwrights used sophisticated mathematical techniques to calculate the optimal curves for different parts of the hull. They worked with proportions, ratios, and geometric relationships that wouldn't be formally codified in naval architecture textbooks for another 2 centuries. They learned metallurgy because they had to understand the properties of nails, bolts, and fittings. Different metals reacted differently with wood and with seawater. Iron was strong but could rust and stain the wood. Copper was more resistant to corrosion but softer. Bronze was ideal but expensive. A master shipwright needed to know which metal to use in which application and how to protect metal components from corrosion. They learned chemistry, though they wouldn't have called it that, so they could prepare and apply the preservative compounds. They learned which substances were compatible, which combinations were toxic, which applications required heat, which needed to cure for specific periods. This knowledge was partly theoretical but mostly empirical, built up through centuries of careful observation and experimentation. But more than specific techniques, they were being socialized into a culture of excellence and secrecy. Master shipwrights saw themselves as guardians of knowledge that was vital to Portugal's national interest. They understood that their skills and secrets were what gave Portugal its maritime advantage, and they took that responsibility extremely seriously. The Portuguese crown recognized this and granted the guild extraordinary privileges and protections. Master shipwrights were exempt from certain taxes. They could not be conscripted for military service. They had the right to demand first choice of timber from royal forests. In legal disputes, their testimony was given special weight. They were, in effect, a protected class of technical experts whose knowledge was considered a strategic national resource. Here's something remarkable. Portuguese master shipwrights were forbidden by law from leaving the country without royal permission. If they did leave and were caught sharing shipbuilding secrets with foreign powers, the punishment was death. This wasn't an empty threat. I found records of at least 3 master shipwrights who were executed in the 16th century for revealing guild secrets to Spanish or English interests. One case is particularly well documented. In 1545, a master shipwright named Manuel Fernandes left Portugal without permission and travelled to Seville, where he contracted with Spanish shipbuilders to teach them Portuguese methods. He was lured back to Portugal under false pretenses, arrested, tried before a special tribunal and executed. His property was confiscated and his family was stripped of any guild privileges they might have inherited. The severity of this punishment might seem extreme, but it reflected how seriously Portugal took the protection of its technological advantages. In an era before patent law or intellectual property rights, the only way to protect technical knowledge was through secrecy and severe penalties for those who betrayed that trust. The Guild also controlled quality through a rigorous inspection system. A ship couldn't be designated as royal or used for crown-sponsored voyages unless it had been inspected and approved by guild masters. These inspections were thorough, examining not just the finished vessel but reviewing records of the wood used, the seasoning process, and the construction methods. Inspectors would check the quality of every major timber. They would test the caulking by flooding sections of the hull and checking for leaks. They would examine the chemical treatments, sometimes taking samples for testing. They would verify that all work had been done by properly trained craftsmen. Any deficiency could result in the ship being rejected, which was a financial disaster for whoever had commissioned it. This quality control system meant that Portuguese ships maintained consistently high standards. When a captain took command of a Portuguese vessel that had been guild-approved, he knew it had been built to exacting specifications by craftsmen with decades of training. There was a level of trust and confidence that simply didn't exist with ships from other nations, where quality could vary wildly. The Guild also drove innovation through a system of regular meetings and knowledge sharing. Master shipwrights would gather quarterly in Lisbon for formal assemblies. These weren't just social events. They were working sessions where problems were discussed and solutions debated. If a ship had failed in some way, whether through structural failure, excessive rot, or poor performance, the guild would investigate why. They would examine the ship if possible, interview the crew, review construction records. Then they would determine what had gone wrong and modify techniques accordingly. This systematic approach to learning from failures was incredibly advanced for its time. If someone developed an improved method, it would be presented to the guild assembly, tested systematically, and if successful, adopted across the guild. One of my favorite examples comes from a guild record from 1518. A shipwright named Antonio Vaz proposed a modification to how deck beams were joined to the hull framework. His method distributed stress more evenly and reduced the tendency for beams to work loose over time. The guild appointed a committee to test his method. They built two identical small vessels, one using the traditional method and one using Vaz's innovation. Both were subjected to identical stress tests and then sent on the same voyages for 2 years. Vaz's method performed noticeably better. The guild formally adopted it. Vaz was rewarded with a bonus payment and elevated status within the guild, and within 5 years, virtually every Portuguese ship was being built using his improved method. This was organizational learning at a very high level. The guild functioned as what we would today call a learning organization or a community of practice. Knowledge wasn't static. It was constantly being refined, improved, and expanded. But nothing lasts forever. The guild system began to break down in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Several factors contributed to this decline. First, Portugal entered a period of political and economic decline after being conquered by Spain in 1580. The personal union with Spain lasted 60 years, and during this time, Portuguese interests were often subordinated to Spanish priorities. The guild system weakened as royal support and funding decreased. Second, many of the best shipwrights were lured away to other countries with promises of high pay, noble titles, and other inducements. Despite the laws forbidding this, enforcement became lax. The King of France offered one master shipwright a large estate and a noble title. The Dutch East India Company hired away several Portuguese experts with offers of extremely generous contracts. Each departure represented not just the loss of one person's knowledge, but the potential spreading of guild secrets to competitors. As more shipwrights left and shared what they knew, Portugal's technological advantage eroded. Third, the Portuguese crown itself, desperate for ships during various conflicts, began pressuring the guild to speed up construction and reduce costs. The careful 20-year seasoning process was shortened to 10 years, then 5. Quality inspections became less rigorous. The standards that had made Portuguese ships superior were compromised in the name of expedience. Finally, other nations were catching up through their own innovations. The Dutch, in particular, developed alternative methods that, while different from Portuguese techniques, produced ships of comparable quality. By the mid-1600s, Dutch ships were widely considered to be as good as or better than Portuguese vessels. By the mid-1600s, Portuguese shipbuilding had lost most of its technological edge. Other nations had caught up or even surpassed them. The guild continued to exist, but was a shadow of its former self. The secrets that had been so carefully guarded gradually leaked out or were independently rediscovered by shipwrights in other countries. The last formal guild assembly was held in 1687. By then, membership had dwindled, royal support had vanished, and the guild had lost most of its authority and prestige. Within a generation, it ceased to exist as a meaningful organization. We've reached the end of our journey into the secret technology behind Portuguese maritime supremacy, but in many ways, this is just the beginning. The story I've shared today represents years of research, Countless hours in archives, conversations with historians and maritime experts, and my own visits to museums and shipyards across Portugal and beyond. What strikes me most about this story is how it illustrates a fundamental truth about history. Technological advantage, not just courage or luck, often determines which nations rise and which fall. Portugal's century of maritime dominance wasn't a miracle. It was engineering. It was systematic knowledge development. It was institutional excellence. The Portuguese combined careful wood selection, patient seasoning processes, innovative hull designs, sophisticated chemical treatments, and a guild system that preserved and advanced knowledge. Each element alone might not have been decisive, but together they created ships that were simply better than anything else on the ocean. Think about what this required. It required vision to invest in processes that took decades to pay off. It required discipline to maintain standards even under pressure. It required humility to learn from failures and continuously improve. It required a culture that valued technical excellence and protected the practitioners of that excellence. And here's what I find most poignant. Almost all of this knowledge was eventually lost. When the Portuguese guild system collapsed, when the long seasoning processes were abandoned for quick construction, when the careful chemical treatments were replaced with cheaper alternatives, much of the detailed technical knowledge disappeared with it. We can reconstruct parts of it from historical records and by studying preserved shipwrecks, but we'll probably never know all the secrets Portuguese master shipwrights knew. This happens more often than we realize. Throughout history, civilizations have achieved technological capabilities that were later forgotten. Roman concrete formulas that produced structures more durable than modern concrete, lost for centuries until recently rediscovered. Damascus steel techniques that created blades of extraordinary quality, still not fully replicated today. Greek fire composition that gave the Byzantine Empire a decisive military advantage. Its exact formula lost to history. Each represents knowledge that once seemed permanent but proved fragile. It makes you wonder what we know today that might be lost tomorrow if we're not careful about preserving and sharing knowledge. How many of our modern technologies depend on tacit knowledge held by a few experts? What happens when those experts retire or die without fully documenting what they know? Are we making the same mistakes that led to the loss of Portuguese shipbuilding secrets? These are uncomfortable questions, but important ones. The Portuguese experience teaches us that technological advantage can be temporary, that knowledge can be lost, and that we need robust systems for preserving and transmitting what we know. But that brings me to you and why I created this video. I've shared this story because I believe history's hidden technological marvels deserve to be known and celebrated. These aren't just dusty facts about the past. They're reminders of human ingenuity, creativity, and the power of systematic knowledge. They're inspirations for what we might achieve in our own time if we approach problems with the same dedication and rigor that Portuguese shipwrights brought to their craft. If you found this fascinating, I have a favor to ask. First, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. I regularly explore hidden technologies and forgotten innovations from history, and I'd love to have you along for future journeys. We're going to explore Roman engineering techniques, Chinese inventions that changed the world, Islamic Golden Age innovations, and so much more. Second, and this is really important to me, leave a comment below telling me what aspect of Portuguese shipbuilding you found most interesting. Was it the 20-year wood seasoning process that seemed insane but was actually brilliant? Was it the chemical treatments that anticipated modern materials science? Was it the guild system that protected and advanced knowledge? Or was it something else entirely? I read every comment, and your feedback genuinely helps me understand what topics to explore in future videos. Sometimes the most interesting discussions happen in the comments, where people share their own knowledge, experiences, and perspectives. I've learned so much from these community discussions, and I look forward to reading your thoughts. Also, if you know other examples of historical technologies that were ahead of their time or clever innovations that have been forgotten, please share them in the comments. This community is full of knowledgeable, curious people, and I absolutely love when you all share your expertise. Some of my best video ideas have come from comments where someone mentioned a fascinating topic I hadn't heard about before. Third, share this video with someone you think would find it interesting, maybe a history buff who loves learning about how things were done in the past. Maybe a sailing enthusiast who would appreciate the technical details of ship construction. Maybe an engineer who would be fascinated by the problem-solving approaches. Or just someone who loves learning about how things work and why they matter. Every share helps spread knowledge about these remarkable achievements and supports the channel so I can continue researching and producing videos like this. Your shares make a real difference. Finally, if you really want to go deeper into this topic, I've put together a comprehensive list of sources and recommendations for further reading in the video description below. There are some excellent books on Portuguese maritime history that I drew on for this research. There are academic papers that analyze wood samples from shipwrecks and reveal their chemical secrets. There are museums in Portugal and elsewhere that have fantastic collections of ships and artifacts from this era. If you're ever in Lisbon, I highly recommend visiting the Maritime Museum and the Belém district, where you can see replicas of Portuguese vessels. Stand on those decks, touch those timbers, and imagine the craftsmen who built them with such incredible skill and patience. It's an experience that brings history alive in a way that no book or video can quite match. I also want to mention that while I've focused on Portuguese innovations, maritime technology development was happening all over the world during this period. Chinese junks had their own sophisticated construction methods. Arab dhows used ingenious designs perfectly adapted to Indian Ocean conditions. Viking longships represented remarkable engineering for their time. Every maritime culture developed techniques suited to their needs and resources. The Portuguese achievement was remarkable, but it was part of a larger human story of innovation and adaptation. We should celebrate all of these achievements and learn from all of them. I want to end with one final thought that keeps coming back to me as I research this topic. The story of Portuguese shipbuilding technology reminds us that small advantages, consistently applied over time, can lead to extraordinary results. The Portuguese didn't build better ships overnight. They developed a system, refined it year after year, generation after generation, and maintained it with discipline and dedication. Each individual innovation, whether it was selecting the right oak trees or mixing the right chemical treatments, might have provided only a small advantage. But these small advantages compounded over time. A ship that lasted 5 years longer than competitors made many more profitable voyages. A hull design that was 5% more efficient meant reaching destinations faster with less risk. A preservation method that reduced maintenance by even a small amount freed up resources for other uses. In our modern world of instant gratification and rapid innovation, there's something to be learned from the Portuguese approach. Some things can't be rushed. Some excellence can only be achieved through patience, careful attention to fundamentals, and respect for accumulated knowledge. The 20 years it took to season ship timber wasn't wasted time. It was essential to the final quality. The 2 decades it took to train a master shipwright weren't excessive. They were necessary to master the depth and breadth of knowledge required. The careful preservation of guild secrets across generations wasn't paranoia. It was protecting a strategic advantage that took centuries to develop. Maybe we've lost something in our rush to move fast and break things. Maybe there are areas where we should be more like those Portuguese master shipwrights, taking the long view, building for durability rather than quick results, and respecting the depth of knowledge required for true excellence. I'm not saying we should reject innovation or cling to old methods simply because they're old. The Portuguese themselves were constant innovators, always testing and improving. But they did so within a framework that valued thoroughness, systematic knowledge, and proven excellence, finding the right balance between innovation and preservation, between speed and quality, between disruption and refinement. These are challenges we still face today. The Portuguese experience offers valuable lessons for how we might approach these challenges. These are the questions I'm left with as I conclude this exploration. What would it mean to apply the Portuguese shipwright's patience and systematic approach to modern challenges? How can we create institutions that preserve and advance knowledge the way the Guild of Master Shipwrights did? How do we balance the need for innovation with the value of accumulated wisdom? How do we ensure that today's knowledge isn't tomorrow's lost art? I don't have all the answers to these questions, but I think they're worth pondering. And they're questions I'd love to discuss with you in the comments. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the hidden technology of Portuguese ships. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. Remember to subscribe, hit that like button, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your engagement truly makes this channel possible and helps these stories reach more people who will appreciate them. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep discovering the hidden stories that make history so endlessly fascinating. There are so many more incredible stories out there waiting to be told, so many forgotten innovations and brilliant solutions to seemingly impossible problems. I'm excited to explore them with you. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and happy learning.